"Do not sign that, Megan. They are using your inn to secure the debt of someone else." The voice of Ethan Foster crossed the conference room, just as the pen in the hand of Megan touched the final page. Every face turned toward him. Rain streaked the tall windows of the Portland law office and blurred the harbor into a field of gray. Ethan stood inside the doorway wearing a faded work jacket and damp boots. He looked like a man who knew he had arrived with no right to be believed. Megan slowly lifted the pen but did not sign. Across the polished table, her fiancé Luc Bernard remained still. His mother Celine tightened one hand around her purse. Megan told Ethan that he needed to leave. Her voice was controlled, but he recognized the anger beneath it. He had heard that same careful tone 4 years earlier when Megan discovered that he had emptied most of their savings to rescue a failing construction business. Back then, he had promised that everything was under control. 3 weeks later, he left for Quebec, while Megan remained in Maine with their infant daughter and a stack of unpaid bills. Ethan had spent years learning that regret did not restore trust. He said he would leave. But first, Megan needed to ask Luc what Bernard North Holdings had to do with the agreement. Luc leaned back and gave Megan a patient smile. He said this was exactly what he had warned her about. Ethan saw her moving forward and had created a conspiracy. Ethan replied that he had not created the company. The Bernard family had created it. The attorney representing Luc closed the contract and asked whether building security should be called. Before Megan could answer, a small voice came from the hallway. Ruby appeared beside the receptionist. Her yellow raincoat was unbuttoned, and one shoelace was loose. She had been coloring in the room for children, while the adults completed the meeting. Ruby was 5 years old and sensed the tension without understanding its cause. Megan rose and asked Ruby to return with the receptionist. Luc stood and extended his hand toward the child. He said the adults needed to handle the conversation. Ruby stepped away from him. Then she crossed the room and wrapped both arms around one leg of Ethan. She said that her father did not lie to her anymore. The movement was small, but it changed the silence. Ethan lowered one hand to the shoulder of Ruby, but did not use her trust as a shield. He said she should not be placed in the middle. Then he looked directly at Megan and told her that she should not sign until every obligation in the contract had been independently explained. Celine said something quietly to Luc in French. She assumed the words would pass over Ethan like meaningless sound. Luc answered her in the same language and his smile disappeared for less than a second. Ethan replied in fluent French. The face of Celine lost its color. Luc froze with one hand resting on the table. Megan understood none of the sentence, but she understood their reaction. Ethan placed a folded sheet beside the contract. It contained the name of a Montreal bank, a loan deadline, and Bernard North Holdings. Then he stepped away from Ruby and turned toward the door. The question now belonged to Luc. How did the disgraced former husband of Megan know the name of a company that her fiancé had never mentioned? The first time Ethan said everything was under control, Megan lost nearly everything. 4 years before he entered the conference room in Portland, Ethan had been a young contractor with a growing reputation and no ability to admit that he was failing. His restoration company expanded too quickly. Every morning he kissed Megan goodbye and told her that business was improving. Megan was 27 and exhausted from caring for their infant daughter. She still trusted her husband enough to believe the numbers he showed her. When Ethan asked to move their emergency savings into the company account for 2 weeks, he described it as a temporary transfer. He promised the money would return before the next mortgage payment. Instead, he used almost all of it to pay suppliers and keep the company from closing. Megan discovered the truth when her debit card was declined while she was purchasing formula for Ruby. Ethan did not confess immediately. He claimed that the bank had made an error. That lie lasted until Megan found a stack of collection notices inside his truck. Ethan had been lying before Ruby was born. He had watched Megan prepare a nursery, calculate medical expenses, and set aside money for their daughter while knowing that the account was nearly empty. When confronted, he defended himself. A construction company in Quebec then offered him an 8-month restoration project. Megan begged him not to go. She needed a husband more than another promise of money. Ethan left anyway. At first he called every evening. Then the calls became shorter and less frequent. He missed the first birthday of Ruby because the project was behind schedule. He missed 2 planned trips home and blamed weather, work, and travel costs. Megan stopped asking when he would return. By the time Ethan came back to Maine, she had moved into a small apartment above the Coastal Inn, owned by her aunt, and had filed for divorce. Ethan believed an apology should earn him another chance. Megan understood that an apology without change was only another request for patience. The court gave him limited parenting time, but even then he disappointed Ruby. He arrived late. He canceled when work interfered. Once he promised to attend an orientation at preschool and called 20 minutes after it ended. Ruby sat on the front steps, holding a paper name tag she had made for him. That evening forced Ethan to see what Megan had understood for years. He was not losing his family because of bad luck. Every crisis had become permission to break another promise. Ethan closed what remained of the company, accepted hourly restoration work, entered financial counseling, and began repaying Megan in small monthly amounts. He stopped asking her to forgive him. He simply arrived when he said he would. For 3 years, his truck appeared outside the school every Tuesday and Saturday before dismissal. That consistency did not erase the past, but it explained why a 5-year-old could trust him when her mother still could not. What Megan never knew was that Ethan had worked beside French-speaking craftsmen in Quebec until he could understand every conversation around him. The language had been learned during the worst chapter of their marriage. Now it had returned carrying the name of a company that Luc Bernard had tried to hide. Luc Bernard never arrived late, and that was the first thing Megan loved about him. He entered her life 14 months before the interrupted signing, during a winter when the Harbor Pine Inn seemed to be failing one room at a time. A storm had damaged part of the roof, 2 heating units needed replacement, and the bank had rejected the request from Megan for a larger renovation loan. Luc first appeared as a guest from Boston. He said he was visiting Maine to review a commercial property for a client. When he noticed Megan comparing repair estimates at the front desk, he offered to explain why the bank disliked her application. Luc returned 2 weeks later with pastries for the staff and a coloring book for Ruby. To Megan, reliability felt less like romance than the first warm room after a long winter. Ethan had trained her to fear promises. Luc rarely made them. He simply appeared. Ruby liked him at first, though she never reached for his hand the way she reached for Ethan. Luc was kind to her, but his kindness had the careful quality of a room prepared for inspection. He chose appropriate gifts, asked polite questions, and smiled when Ruby talked about her father. Only once did his expression change. Ruby showed him a drawing of herself standing between Megan and Ethan at a school picnic. Luc studied it before saying that families could look different when people made better choices. Megan heard reassurance. Ruby quietly took the drawing back. By spring, Luc had begun discussing marriage. He also introduced a plan to stabilize the inn permanently. The investment company owned by his family could refinance the existing mortgage, fund the roof repairs, and place the business inside a limited liability company. Megan would remain the majority owner. Luc described the arrangement as protection for the future of Ruby and presented every step with patient confidence. Unlike Ethan, he encouraged Megan to read the documents. He answered questions before she finished asking them. When she hesitated, he never raised his voice. He said he wanted her to feel safe. Megan wanted to believe that safety could be chosen as carefully as a mortgage rate. She accepted his proposal in the empty dining room of the inn while rain tapped against the windows. A month later, Luc brought Celine to inspect the property before the final financing meeting. Celine admired the ocean view, praised the work of Megan, and asked detailed questions about occupancy and expenses. Then Luc unfolded the property map across the front desk. His attention moved past the inn, the parking lot, and the weathered storage building. He placed one finger on the narrow strip of undeveloped land behind the pine trees. He asked whether the parcel was free of debt. Megan said it was. Her aunt had purchased it separately many years earlier, and Megan had never borrowed against it. Luc smiled and folded the map, but the eyes of Celine remained fixed on the boundary line. Megan thought they were protecting her investment. She did not yet understand why the only unencumbered piece of her property mattered more to them than the inn itself. He restores houses owned by other people because he could not keep his own home. Celine said the words in French and smiled across the dinner table as if she had offered Ethan a compliment. The engagement dinner was held in the small dining room of the Harbor Pine Inn on Wednesday evening, less than 48 hours before the financing deadline. Ethan had not planned to attend. He had come directly from a restoration job to return Ruby after an afternoon visit. He still wore a charcoal work shirt and boots marked with pale sawdust. Ruby begged him to stay for dessert. Megan hesitated, but she did not want her daughter to believe that loving both parents required choosing between them. Luke pulled out an extra chair and welcomed Ethan with effortless politeness. Celine watched him sit down as though someone had placed a toolbox beside the fine dishes. Ruby sat beside him and drew a lighthouse on a paper napkin, while the adults discussed the financing. When Ethan helped her spell the word ocean, Celine turned toward Luke and spoke in French. She said the child worshipped Ethan, and that the attachment would become inconvenient. Luke glanced at Megan before answering in the same language. He said children admired whoever knelt closest to them, and that Ruby would understand when she was older. Ethan kept his eyes on the drawing. Celine continued because his silence made her feel safe. She mocked his clothes, his rented apartment, and the marriage he had failed to preserve. Some of her judgment was cruel. Some of it was accurate. That was what made remaining quiet difficult. Ethan could have answered in fluent French and watched embarrassment move across their faces. Instead, he asked Ruby whether the lighthouse needed another window. Megan noticed the tension in his shoulders but mistook it for discomfort around Luke. She had seen Ethan become defensive whenever another man occupied a place he had abandoned. Luke raised his glass and thanked Megan for trusting his family with the future of the inn. Then he praised her strength and added that she deserved a partner who did not disappear when life became difficult. Ethan accepted the remark without protest because it belonged to him. Ruby did not. She said that her father always came back now. Her voice was soft, but everyone heard it. Ethan placed his hand beside hers without touching the drawing. He told Ruby that her mother knew what had happened and that they did not need to change the story. Megan looked at him with surprise because he offered no excuse. Later, while Megan carried dessert plates into the kitchen and Ruby followed her, Ethan remained near the dining room door. Celine leaned toward Luke and spoke rapidly in French. She asked whether the Montreal bank had confirmed the Friday deadline. Luke told her not to worry. Once the main property entered the agreement, the bank would have what it required. Celine asked whether Megan understood that part. Luke looked toward the kitchen and smiled. He said Megan understood what he needed her to understand. Ethan stood motionless beneath the warm dining room lights. He still did not know the entire plan, but he now knew that the agreement was not only about repairing the inn. The Bernard family had less than 2 days to obtain the property of Megan. Even if the contractor becomes suspicious, Megan will never believe him. Luke spoke in French and did not know that the porch heater had just fallen silent behind the glass door. Ethan remained crouched beside the metal unit with one hand resting on a wrench. Megan had called him on Thursday morning because the heater stopped working during dinner. The nearest repair company could not come until the following week, and the inn had guests arriving that afternoon. He agreed to inspect it without charging her. Inside the breakfast room, Luke and Celine sat at a table covered with documents for the financing appointment on Friday. They could see Ethan through the glass, but the thick door and the hum of the heater made them believe he could not hear them. His stained work jacket apparently convinced them that he could not understand them either. Celine asked whether the Montreal bank had accepted the undeveloped parcel behind the inn. Luke explained that the bank had not received control of any main property yet. First, Megan had to contribute the Harbor Pine property to the new limited liability company. Once the agreement was signed, Bernard North Holdings could use the unencumbered parcel as additional security for its existing commercial loan. Luke assured her that Megan would sign. He had presented the documents as a way to repair the inn, reduce the mortgage payment, and protect the future of Ruby. The section connecting the main property to the Montreal loan appeared only in the operating agreement and used language that many small business owners would not easily recognize. Celine warned that Megan read everything. Luke replied that she read what he explained to her. He said Megan wanted stability, and that people who had lived through financial chaos rarely questioned the person offering safety. Ethan felt the words settle heavily inside him. Celine glanced toward the patio and asked what would happen if Ethan interfered. Luke looked through the glass at the man kneeling beside the heater. He said Ethan had emptied the savings of Megan, abandoned her with a baby, and missed the first birthday of his own daughter. Luke only needed to tell the truth about him. Luke continued speaking and named the Montreal bank, the payment deadline, and the holding company that would receive the financial benefit after Megan signed. Ethan repeated each detail silently until it was fixed in his memory. The glass door opened behind him. Ruby stepped onto the patio wearing a purple sweater over her pajamas. Ethan accepted the coffee, but Ruby studied his face instead of the heater. She asked whether he had broken something. Ethan said he had heard something he was not supposed to hear. Ruby glanced through the glass at Luke and Celine. She asked whether it was bad. Ethan looked at the daughter who had learned to trust him only after years of small and ordinary promises. Telling Megan could cost him the fragile place he had rebuilt in their lives. Remaining silent could cost Megan the home she had saved without him. Ruby slipped her hand into his and said that her father had to tell her mother the truth. Ethan closed his fingers around hers and stood. This time he would not decide the future of Megan for her. He would give her the truth, even if she chose never to believe him again. Everything you are accusing Luke of doing is something you once did to me. Ethan had waited until Ruby returned to the kitchen with the breakfast manager before telling Megan what he had heard. He gave her the name Bernard North Holdings, the name of the Montreal bank, the Friday deadline, and the reason the family of Luke needed the undeveloped parcel. Megan listened without interrupting, but her expression grew colder with every detail. She reminded Ethan that he had hidden debt, used money that belonged to both of them, and told her that one contract would save their family. Then he had left her to deal with the cost. Ethan said she was right. Ethan said she should question him because he had given her every reason to do so. Megan said there was no proof. Ethan replied that there were facts she could check. He said that if the company, bank, and deadline were real, his past would not make them disappear. Before Megan could respond, Luke entered from the hallway carrying coffee. His smile faded when he saw Ethan. Luke asked why Ethan was still there. Ethan glanced at Megan and allowed her to decide how much to reveal. Megan said only that they were discussing the financing documents. Luke set down the coffee and looked at Ethan with quiet understanding. He asked whether Ethan had told Megan that he was trying to take the inn. Ethan said nothing. Luke turned to Megan and said he had hoped they would not have to face this problem again. On his phone, he opened the public record of the failed company once owned by Ethan, followed by the divorce filing and a civil claim from an unpaid supplier. None of it was fabricated. Luke did not need to invent a villain when the history of Ethan already supplied one. Luke said Ethan saw Megan signing a future with someone else and had suddenly discovered a secret financial conspiracy. Ethan absorbed the accusation without defending himself. He asked Luke to explain why Bernard North Holdings appeared in the agreement. The eyes of Luke remained steady. He said it was one of several family entities and that its presence did not make the agreement dangerous. Ethan asked why the Montreal bank needed the land of Megan by Friday. For the first time, the composure of Luke shifted. The change was small, no more than a pause before he answered, but Megan noticed it. Luke said commercial financing involved complicated relationships that Ethan could not understand. Ethan protected the one advantage he still possessed. He did not reveal that he understood every French word spoken at dinner and on the patio. Instead, he looked at Megan and asked her to read every page without Luke beside her. Then he left before Luke could turn the conversation into another contest between two men. That night, after Ruby fell asleep, Megan carried the financing packet to the dining room. Rain whispered against the windows while she read each page slowly. The main agreement named the expected investment company. Nothing mentioned a failing loan or a Montreal deadline. Near midnight, Megan reached the final operating appendix, a section Luke had described as routine management language. Halfway down the page, beneath a paragraph about additional secured obligations, she found 4 words she had never seen before. Bernard North Holdings Incorporated. If you sign this agreement, the inn could become responsible for a debt you never borrowed. Sarah Mitchell placed one finger beneath the paragraph Megan had found after midnight. Friday morning, light filled the office of the attorney in Portland, but Megan still felt as though she were reading in darkness. Sarah explained that the danger was not a direct and immediate transfer of ownership. The signing package would contribute the Harbor Pine Inn and its undeveloped parcel to a new limited liability company. Another provision allowed that company to guarantee certain obligations connected to Bernard North Holdings. If the Montreal company failed to satisfy its registered loan obligations, the main property could become part of an enforcement dispute. Megan said Luke had told her that the structure would protect the future of Ruby. Sarah replied that it protected the position of the lender. Whether Luke intended to deceive Megan was a separate issue, but he had not accurately explained the risk. Sarah contacted commercial counsel in Montreal and reviewed public corporate filings, registered financing statements, and liens connected to Bernard North Holdings. Those records confirmed that the company carried substantial secured debt and had recently requested changes to its borrowing arrangements. The records did not reveal every private demand made by the bank, but they confirmed enough of the warning from Ethan to make the agreement dangerous. The amount attached to the registered obligations was far greater than the renovation funding promised to Megan. Ethan had been correct about the company and the financial connection. Canceling the agreement meant losing the money for the damaged roof and failing heating system. Winter reservations would not cover both repairs. Sarah said Megan might need to sell part of the undeveloped parcel, reduce operations, or seek a smaller loan at a higher rate. There was no hidden rescue waiting behind the honest choice. Megan needed to hear Luke explain Bernard North Holdings while he still believed she was unaware of its purpose. She wanted to know whether the man she planned to marry would tell the truth when lying was no longer necessary. Sarah prepared a written withdrawal and agreed to remain in a nearby office during the scheduled meeting. Megan would not sign. She would ask Luke one direct question first. On the drive back toward the law office where the signing would occur later that morning, Megan called Ethan. She told him that being right did not mean she knew what to do with everything else. Ethan said she owed him nothing because he had heard the conversation. He asked her to protect the inn and Ruby, and promised to stay out of the way. On the passenger seat was a picture Ruby had drawn the previous evening. It showed 3 people beneath a crooked blue roof. Megan recognized herself, Ruby, and Ethan. Luke was not there. When Megan had asked whether Ethan suggested the picture, Ruby shook her head. She said her father told her that pictures had to be her own choices. The trust of Ruby did not come from one dramatic warning. It came from hundreds of ordinary moments Megan had been too hurt to count. Megan placed the withdrawal letter inside her coat and entered the signing room. Luke had already opened the contract to the final page and was smiling as though the future of Megan belonged to him. "Say that again in English, Luke." The voice of Megan was quiet, but it stopped every movement in the conference room. Ethan had just answered Celine in fluent French, and confidence had vanished from both Bernard faces. Ruby still stood beside her father with one small hand wrapped around 2 of his fingers. She had told Luke that a woman abandoned once would sign almost anything to avoid being abandoned again. Luke had answered that the fear of Megan was more dependable than her judgment. Ethan repeated both statements in English without raising his voice. The attorney representing Luke slowly removed his hand from the telephone. Megan felt the withdrawal letter inside her coat, but she did not reach for it yet. She asked Luke to explain Bernard North Holdings. Megan asked why the Montreal loan of that company appeared in her operating agreement. Luke began speaking about shared obligations, flexible financing, and temporary guarantees. Each phrase sounded polished, but none answered the question. Megan asked whether the undeveloped parcel behind her inn could be used to support obligations connected to Bernard North Holdings. Luke said the possibility was remote. Megan replied that remote did not mean impossible. The conference room door opened, and Sarah entered carrying a slim folder. She introduced herself as independent counsel for Megan and handed the attorney representing Luke a written notice that Megan was withdrawing from the transaction. Sarah explained that the agreement connected the Harbor Pine property to financial obligations that had not been fully disclosed to Megan. Any further communication would go through her office. Celine rose and protested that the family had already spent money arranging the financing. Megan removed her engagement ring and placed it beside the unsigned contract. She asked for an itemized statement of any legitimate expense, but said the Bernard family would not use the future of Ruby to repair its company. He reminded her about the damaged roof, the failing heaters, and the bank that had rejected her. Without his financing, she might be forced to sell part of the property. She said she would sell what she chose but would not surrender what he had chosen for her. Luke turned toward Ethan and asked whether exposing the agreement made him a better man. Ethan looked at Megan rather than Luke. He said telling the truth that day did not change what he had done to her. The answer left Luke without the confrontation he wanted. Ethan was not competing for Megan. He was refusing to let another man repeat his worst mistake. Luke followed her to the door, but first told Megan that she would regret trusting a former husband who had already failed her. Ruby stepped closer to Ethan. She said her mother had not chosen her father. Her mother had chosen the truth. Ethan knelt and tied the loose shoelace of Ruby. He prepared to leave without asking Megan for anything. Megan watched his hands and remembered how often those same hands had once reached for another promise instead of the truth. She called his name. Ethan looked up. Megan asked why he had never told her that he spoke French. The question followed him into the hallway and carried them toward a part of their past neither had faced honestly. "I learned it while I was leaving you." Ethan stood in the courthouse hallway with the small hand of Ruby resting inside his, and for once he did not soften the truth. He explained that most of the craftsmen on the Quebec restoration project spoke French. During the months when he ignored calls from Megan and missed the first birthday of Ruby, he learned the language by working beside them every day. He returned to Maine able to speak fluently, but admitting that fact felt like displaying a prize earned during the most shameful period of his life. Megan told him that exposing Luke did not erase any of it. Ethan said he knew. He said the truth should not become another debt she had to repay him. In the months that followed, Sarah formally withdrew the property of Megan from the Bernard Agreement and sent notice that the proposed guarantee had never been authorized with complete disclosure. Megan still faced the damaged roof and the winter bills. She sold a narrow portion of the undeveloped parcel to a neighboring conservation organization, secured a smaller loan from a local credit union, and kept control of the inn. Ethan offered to complete the roof repairs for only the cost of materials. Megan refused. If he worked on her property, there would be a written estimate, a clear schedule, and fair payment. Ethan agreed. He finished the job 3 days before the first snow and never asked whether the work had changed how Megan saw him. Trust returned in quieter ways. Megan began calling when Ruby needed to change weekends instead of communicating only through email. Ethan stopped at the inn for coffee after school pickups but left when it was time to leave. He did not mistake access for forgiveness. 4 months later, the kindergarten class of Ruby held a graduation ceremony in the elementary school auditorium. Paper stars hung above the stage and rows of folding chairs filled the room. Ethan arrived early but paused when he saw Megan sitting near the center aisle. An empty chair waited beside her with the handmade program of Ruby resting on the seat. Ethan asked whether the chair was taken. Megan said Ruby had asked her to save it for her father. Ethan sat down without moving the chair closer. When Ruby appeared in a blue paper cap, she searched the audience until she found both parents together. Her smile arrived before the music began. After the ceremony, Ruby ran toward them and held a certificate in both hands. Megan watched Ethan kneel and admire every uneven letter in the name of their daughter. Megan said Ruby had been right about him. Ethan asked what she meant. Megan said he did not lie to Ruby anymore and no longer disappeared when staying became difficult. It was not an invitation to return home, and Ethan did not treat it as one. Megan had not forgotten the man he had been. She had simply begun to recognize the man his daily choices were creating. A second chance did not begin when Ethan exposed the lie of another man. It began when he finally learned that staying was more important than being forgiven.